it's a lot, but it's also overwhelming. And I have to go, what I have to do to make that paragraph make sense is go to the most abstract way in which we're talking about a heuristic of suspicion, and then like ignore the specifics entirely. And then if I do that, I can take the charitable reading that Jason is taking, but I can't do it without doing that, which makes it a muddled paragraph no matter how you parse it. Like,
well, yeah, if you want the material to be accessible to everybody and understandable, then it's worth spending more time on that.
It's worth noting
it's not the Bible, we don't have to parse out what they mean in Deuteronomy,
but it's worth noting
right now.
It's worth noting in this book, as we're about halfway through it, which parts of it are very clear and just like surface on the face of it and understandable, and which parts start to get really muddled and confusing. I think that's a product of Dugin having a muddled and confusing philosophy, but also this sleight of hand that we've been talking about since the very, very beginning, this bringing people under like broad first principles that seem self-explanatory, that if you're on the left, you could agree with it. If you're on the right, you could agree with it. And then you get into the nuts and bolts of it, as we are in the middle here, the actual philosophical content, the political content of it. And it's necessarily becomes obscurantist because A, he's an irrationalist, and B, he's trying to pull the wool over people's eyes and create something like, I don't know, the American Communist Party out of this shit. And I guess it's kind of working in that sense.
Which is both a chauvinistic stance about American culture, but also an anti-chauvinistic stance about American culture simultaneously. I mean, that is something that is different about the ACP than, say, the LaRouchites, where the LaRouchites have a clear conspiratorial singular worldview that's really based in a dude. And the ACP really doesn't. Like, it's multiple, slightly incoherent philosophies, incoherently smashed together, papered over by cheesy AI. Oh, God. I mean, it's aesthetic, but like,
and more open anti-Semitism and blood libel. The Jews killed Jesus. You can get that straight from the ACP.
Yeah.
Moving on.
Consequently, for those of you who don't know, that literally came out today that Jackson Hinkle's like, you can't trust anything they do. After all, they killed Jesus. And I'm like, oh, wow, we're there, huh?
We're doing it. We're doing it.
I would like to make a Christian apologist argument against the idea that you should blame anybody for conducting the will of God. That was the whole point.
That was the whole point. Without the crucifixion, what do you even have?
Yeah, it does seem... I'm not going to get into the weirdness of Christian blood libel claims, but it always has seemed to me like not particularly coherent to be like, the Jews did what God wanted them to do, and therefore we hate them.
Right. The Jews did what God wanted them to do. Now, therefore, we're saved, and we hate them.
Right.
That's actually a really good reason. That's a perfect example of why you have to have both a cultural understanding of history, but also an economic one. Because if you don't understand the motivations behind what people say, then you just seem to say things which are just incomprehensible. I mean, good or bad, they only make sense if you also understand what else was happening that they weren't talking about.
Listen, clout chasing internet rackets, those are a great economic incentive, I tell you.
Well, yeah. Maybe. I don't know.
We'll see how it pans out.
I was listening to Alex Jones talk about how many views he got on something on X, and then talking about how it didn't translate to any engagement or sales, and he didn't put it together that meant that like we got 1 million views, but we're not selling anything. And I'm like, doesn't that imply that your 1 million views are bots? Like,
strongly implies that. Yeah.
It at least makes a solid argument.
Either 100% bots or mostly bots with a bunch of like poor teenagers thrown in the mix who can't even afford InfoWar mugs.
As a person who I've watched people on Twitter that when I left Twitter X like 7 months ago and came back, their following has gone from like 4,000 to like 10,000. And I'm going like, how in the fuck did that? But then I'm watching it myself and looking at my own numbers. Like I've already got back a half of what I used to have. It took me 10 years to get prior. But when I go through them, like every second person doesn't have a single post.
Right.
It's like okay.
Mine
anyway,
hasn't gone up at all since the turnover, and I'm just guessing it's because I'm the most honest poster on the internet. I wouldn't accept the bots even if they had me.
Anyway, I think this is interesting here. Consequently, civilization has not merely removed savagery and barbarism, entirely overcoming them, but it itself is built precisely on savage and barbaric grounds, which transfer to the sphere of the unconscious. But there is not only nowhere to escape from this, on the contrary, they acquire unlimited power over man to the extent precisely because they are thought to be overcome and even non-existent. This is where the striking difference between historical practices of nations and societies, full warfare, oppression, cruelty, and the wild outbursts of terror, abounding in the abrogating psychological disorders and pretensions of reason to harmonious, peaceful, and enlightened existence under the shadow of progress and development. In this respect, the modern era is not only an exception, but also the peak of the intensification of this discrepancy between the pretensions of reasons and the bloody reality of world wars, ethnic cleansing, and historically unprecedented mass genocides of entire races and Narodny. Way to do that, translator. Keep it Russian when you can just translate it as peoples. Anyway,
Crazy choice.
There is a little bit of disagreement about how to translate it, actually, because it does just mean peoples. But does it mean peoples in the way that we mean people, or does it mean people in the way that the German mean Volk, which means people? That distinction
means people in the way the German means Volk and our folk, and the Jew means Goy,
right?
So. Which are the Korean means Waikugen. It means of a different culture, peoples of a different nation.
Yeah. So basically, I think I agree with the decision to keep it in Russian.
I don't know. I mean, like, I know what peoples means. No, peoples. If I'd said peoples versus people, I think I still would have got that. Like, if I say people, I agree with you. It's a mistranslation. Anyway, we could go back and forth about how you translate Narodny, because I don't speak Russian at all.
Nah, me neither. Not even close.
It's you would say Narodi.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter because hopefully you won't say it again anyways.
All right. In terms of savagery, modernity passes the most perfect technical means invented by civilization right up to weapons of mass destruction. And thus the critical tradition, structuralism, and the philosophy of postmodernity force. I think structuralism and philosophy of the postmodernity are actually diametrically opposed, as in the philosophy of postmodernity was post-structuralism. But anyway, force one to move from the mainly diachronic phase interpretation of civilization, which was the norm for the 19th century, and which by inertia continues to be widely in use, to be synchronic. So we're no longer talking about different stages, but civilizations are static things in time. Which that's a weird jump, and that is using him using Saussurean categories from Saussurean. That's structural linguistics.
Yeah, so like Dugin will talk about things to be like everything is dialectical except for the things we should never change. Some things are static forever, and some things are in constant motion.
Yo, this dude is he's such an undergrad. Dugin is such an undergrad, dude. He's like a philosophy 200 type guy. You know, he's gotten over like the basics, but now he's just like throwing everything he's got at the wall. This is very pretentious.
I somewhat agree. I would even, my thing about this is like we do have to recognize the fundamental irrationalism of the way he ad hocs different frameworks and throws them together without dealing with the fact that frameworks are not copacetic. They don't have similar epistemological, ontological, and material assumptions. And I think he's trying. You see, this is where like the charitable versus uncharitable reading becomes really important, but it also is hard for me to square this with other Dugin that I've read outside of this book. Because sometimes I'm like, no, you'll blatantly contradict what you say in this book and other books, and it feels like it's because it's written for a different audience. And like, does that mean I should go ahead?
He just contradicts himself, and he's just okay with it. Whereas,
yeah, that too.
I think maybe you should just be a little bit more concerned with it. Whereas he just, I think if you asked him like, you said these two different things, and he would give you a big answer about why reality is these two different things. So I think he's trying to do something interesting. I just think it's not very clear.
This just
he was like, before he converted to Orthodox Christianity, he was a chaos musician, and I think it shows.
Yeah.
I was gonna say this reads to me like undergrad crank shit, like the kind of shit we would like maybe smoke a little DMT in the dorm room or whatever, and fucking wow, the fucking cosmos, the universe. I don't know.
Yeah, man. When I was 25, I wrote.
You're probably right.
I wrote for a magazine called Green Triangle, and I tried to come up with a theory of civilization like this, and it was fucking stupid, and I have suppressed every last bit of it from the internet that anyone can ever find.
We have to get into the files. We got to find that file.
Coming soon. Fifth political theory. But
the pre-Marxist political theory of Varn is a lot weirder than
someday it's going to make it. Someday when your Marxist Internet Archive page goes up, that's going to be like the first, like in the prefatory notes towards Varnism.
Yeah, then like someone will be like against Western Varnism and cite my early pre-Marxist works as my Marxist works, and then like say it doesn't make any sense. Anyway,
yeah, I was into Varn before he was a Marxist.
which if you were, okay.
What are you still doing here?
I'm really more of a Reformation Varn. I'm more like Calvinist Varn.
Yeah.
No, I'm not a Calvinist anything.
Because I had like a Buddhist theory of politics that also was like vaguely kind of fascistic. But anyway.
Well, look, from small beginnings, right?
All right. Savagery is that which explains civilization and is key to it. It turns out that man buried to proclaim civilization as that which has already actually happened, which it remains no more than an incomplete plan, constantly suffering disruption under the onslaught of cunning energies of the unconscious. However, we might understand it as the Nietzschean will to power are psychoanalytically. I mean, okay, sure. Like, civilization is based on a fundamental crime. Even Benjamin agrees with that, so fine. Yeah. The deconstruction of civilization. Okay, let's get into this. However, in practice, one can apply structuralist approaches for the deconstruction of the concept of civilization. Skip ahead. The main characteristic of civilization is often thought to be an inclusive university. That is, the theoretical openness of the civilizational code for those who would like to join it from without. Inclusive university is, at first glance, the complete antithesis of exclusive particularity, the primary characteristic of tribal and ancestral societies of pre-civilizational period. Asterisk. Bullshit! Unasterisk. Anyone who's ever studied anthropology knows that is bullshit. Like, tribes will come up with weird fucking kinship justifications to be able to include people.
Yeah.
Also, what the fuck do you think marriage is? Like, you're usually banned from marrying within your tribe. So, yeah. Go ahead.
This is a good example of like when you try to imagine the past, but you can only do so with a contemporary lens. So we imagine like the Flintstones, caveman gets in his car and goes to work. He joins the lodge. He has marital, whatever. Maybe it's interesting, but that's really bad for a historian to do. And this is why.
Right.
Agreed.
But the historical procedures.
And it's always a very right wing. I'm sorry, but it's always a very it's always right wing coded whenever anybody does that, right? This attempt to take the present and then thrust it off into the past.
Well, yeah, although it is interesting how I think that is, I would actually challenge you a little bit because of David Graeber's whole fucking career is basically X thing from the anthropological past or from objectively less socially complex societies. And I'm not using complexity as a good thing here. I want people to know that. It's just that is actually the exact same as X complicated thing from later on. So for Graeber, for example, he'll argue that the state is basically just kinship. Because it's an extrapolation of the same tendency, but because he has nary, and I don't have as much as our friend Jason here, but since he has nary a shred of Hegel in his bones, he can't see that like eventually quality becomes quantity and vice versa. So if you expand the size of the claim of the extension, it changes its nature eventually. So the state isn't reducible to kinship, really, even though it emerges from the same process. Yeah, go ahead.
At most, you could say you can see it, expressions of what will eventually become the state in certain from a certain vantage point when it comes to kinship. You could say that there's embryonic ideas which conglomerated together in a much more complex way because of all sorts of other factors. You can see how the one tendency can become its own distinct reality, and that's the state. And that tendency might be present earlier, but they're not the same at all.
Right. But I will say that post-structuralists do tend to do what Dugin is doing here, which is to see that the structural components being similar means that they're the same thing, and thus we can, if like we're just undoing Marin additives, for example, or something like that.
Right.
Like which is the wrong way to think about it. And even though there's a real impulse there that it's not to, it is to be applauded. Like, yeah, that some of our civilizational wiggishness is utter bullshit, and it's a cover for other things that we're doing that is not pretty. But inverting it as if, well, everybody just lies and they're all basically the same thing is a different, like, that's not the conclusion you should probably actually reach. But if you were just flipping the assumption on its head, that's what you would do. And I think this is like, I hate to give Matt McManus a whole lot of credit. I mean, he's a friend of mine, but like, I often disagree with his liberal socialism stuff. But I think he is right about even the left part of post-structuralism, even the parts of it that are maybe true. There is a way in which it is unconsciously right-wing coded because it does not see any way out of a perpetual universal status quo.
Yeah,
that is
that's the thing about this book in particular that I am very sympathetic to. All else aside, there is this impasse that, you know, as a result of liberalism being triumphant over its negation and whatever its other negation, and even the communists become liberals, but they're still communists, and the fascists become liberals, but they're still, you know. So I'm sympathetic to that and his attempt to construct a way out of it, but I'm not sympathetic to all kinds of stuff. But I am super sympathetic to this book, but I also would not want to promote it because I would only want to read it with people like you.
Yeah, this is one of those books
Safely.
that, like,
yeah, exactly.
This is one of those books that if you take at face value, it's going to lead you, I think, into some very bad places. But it is the kind of challenge that we don't get enough anymore about what the stakes of liberalism are. And I do think it's interesting. I will give Dugin a little bit of being on the zeitgeist of where the right in the West was actually going to go. Because, 6 years later, you get Patrick Deneen and Ron Dreyer and Vermicule and those kind of guys. They're not Duginists, but they say similar things about liberalism and the way
they're grasping in a similar direction.
Right.
They're grasping in a similar direction, even though it's not exactly the same.
Right. There's something in the emergent field that is leading right-wingers into this kind of direction. And also in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the stagnation and beginning unraveling of communism had also led left-wingers there. That's the way I would explain this. And there is something about the weird tension between civilization, colonialism, and imperialism that does get worked out in very vulgar terms in a lot of the Marxist left, which this rhymes with, but it actually isn't the same thing if you go through it slowly. But I just don't know if he wants you to go through it slowly. like there's a certain amount of like, I don't know if he wants you to really pull this threads out this detailedly. Maybe he does. It's hard for me to tell from the way he's writing, and I also can't tell from the translation either. So, like you know,
I was trying to compare them, but
maybe the point is you have to read Dugin in the original Russian.
Honestly, there's something to that. I'm very sympathetic to that, not just about Dugin, but about this basic argument that you can always get a sense of what is being proposed. It's worth translating pamphlets and books and so on. But sometimes you can even mostly can only get the full meaning in the original language, because every translation is going to be different, and some translations are going to be 70% good and 70 whatever. You have to read like multiple translations in capital before you really understand. Yeah, and that's just like, and you can pick examples like poetry or dramatic. Yeah, dramatic.
I would say even worse with Hegel, even more than with Marx. Like because like so many of the Hegelian, I call them puns. I don't mean that they're funny, but like the Hegelian double play on words. Like what in English, you have to pick whether you're translating them as spiritual or rational, and in the original German, they are clearly both. Like Zeitgeist, for example, both has a religious and a non-religious meaning in Hegel. Like
like I was trying to compare the standard, like the Miller translation of the phenomenology, and then the new one, the Fuss and Dobbins, which is actually, I think, eminently more readable, but until I know German, I won't know which one is, more faithful to whatever. And I don't want to read both because it's not the most fun stuff to read.
Honestly, Jason, I don't even know that if you learn modern German, it would get you there, because I have read Hegel in German, and I hit things that I'm like, what? And I go back and I'm like, oh, I have to know this pun in Swabian dialect from 200 years ago. Like, fuck. And
that's why I think it's worth reading all kinds of stuff all the time. That's why I would read this, not because I'm like, oh, this is the missing piece of my ideology, but because some thoughts are going to permeate in the world anyways. I want to understand them.
Well, this is one thing where I'm sympathetic to some of these like weird left-right hybrid people, where I will give them a little bit of credit. You do need to read right-winger sympathetically, and simply not engaging them does not actually get you out of the problem. Like, in fact, it just makes you completely blind when they throw something at you that's going to like sound like something you already believe in, and then you're just gonna be like, what? Like,
I think I've said this before, but it's my favorite. The best thing that who's the guy's name? The Oregon guy.
Wilhelm Reich.
Yeah, really the only, I think, very valuable observation from Wilhelm Reich is that when there would be a rally and communist agitator would stand up and he would give a speech, which was very moving if you already agreed, because he would talk about the forces of production and the movement of history and development and so on. And then the Nazi speaker would get up and he would speak to all kinds of things, which to the communists seems absurd, but to a bunch of people, all different kinds of people for different reasons, felt their, this heartstring plucked or that heartstring plucked, or this vague concern, which is not quite so easily definable as the communist guy says. The Nazi was able to talk about these things that the communists were just like not schooled in it because they weren't debating, they weren't engaging with the mystical or whatever, And
even
turns out to have mattered a lot.
Even on something like workers' dignity, communists would be like, well, that's too abstract, we're not going to use that. And part of me is sympathetic to that as an analytic. And you guys will hear me talk about this with justice a lot. That's my key term that I focus in on so much. But I actually realize that, like, if I don't have an answer for justice, I'm like, fuck, man, who's going to listen to me? But
this is
at the same time.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying when Mao was talking about the mass line versus the party line, this is kind of why. I mean, I'm not a big Mao. I'm not a fan, whatever. But there's some interesting things in there like that. You have to be able to know how to, dare I say, talk to people in a language that they speak, while also holding in your own head what you would like to say. I
take up this a lot when I read Mao, and I'll read Mao, and I'm like, this sounds like fucking Taoist folk wisdom are, it sounds very dry and stupid. Like his stuff on practice, like, through practice. I'm like, well, what the fuck does that actually mean? Nothing.
Yeah.
But then I'm thinking about, like, okay, but he's talking to illiterate peasants. And I don't mean that to be like, oh, they're stupid. That's not my point. It's like, but he's trying to meet them at a vocabulary level. And
right.
And we're also reading it in English, which either can be both over exoticized in translation or under exoticized in translation simultaneously, with Chinese in particular. So it's like, it's hard to know, even, like I've often said, like you'll hear liberalism refer to some things in Mao where you're just like, what? Like, what? But what's the context in Chinese? Like, anyway, back to this. I mean, we're recognizing this groundlessness. Various decisions can also follow. Either we try to find a syncretic model of unification of both civilizations, at least in theory, into a general system, or admit the correctness of other civilization. Okay, we got a twist. So we're talking about civilization as a singular concept. Now we got civilizations as a multiple concept, or the correctness of other civilizations. But he's already been speaking as if the only conception of civilization prior is Western civilization. And so this is where I'm not sure. Like, I'm not sure this is a bait and switch, but it does seem strategically very subtle in a way that makes my hackle go up. Because we haven't admitted that there are other valid concepts of civilization really at all in this reaccount of what it is.